Some more help with the Bible that you didn't ask for. In a previous video, I discussed the first two chapters of Genesis, considering the two versions of the creation story that you find there, as a way of explaining or illustrating how best to approach the biblical text. Today, I thought I would do the same with one of the gospel stories. My choice for this was pretty random. I simply gave ChatGPT this task. This is what I told ChatGPT to do. Pick a story from the New Testament that occurs in all three synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark and Luke, and point out the differences between these accounts. It happened to come up with the story of Jesus healing the blind man, maybe Bartimaeus, maybe two men, somewhere near Jericho. So, okay, why not? Let's go with that. You can find an account of this story in Mark chapter 10, verses 46 to 52, Matthew chapter 20, verses 29 to 34, Luke chapter 18, verses 35 to 43. Don't worry, I'll put those chapters and verses in the detailed description below. So let's dive right in by considering the similarities and differences between these three versions of this story. In Mark and Luke, it's only one blind man. Mark actually gives him a name. He calls him Bartimaeus. In Matthew's version, there are two blind men. In Mark's and Matthew's versions, this miracle occurs as Jesus and his disciples are leaving Jericho. In Luke, it happens while they're approaching Jericho. In Mark and Luke, the blind man calls Jesus, Jesus the Son of David. In Matthew, it's Lord, Son of David. All agree that the crowd rebuked him or them, and that Jesus either asked the crowd to bring the man over or ordered him to come over. Mark adds a little more dialogue and detail here. Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. A nice little Monty Python-esque touch. All three writers agree that Jesus asked the man or men what he wanted Jesus to do for him. They all agree that he said, I want to see. In Mark at this point, the man calls Jesus Rabbi. In Matthew and Luke, it's Lord. In Mark's and Luke's versions, Jesus simply tells the man, go, your faith has healed you, or some minor variant on that. And his sight is restored and he follows Jesus rejoicing. In Matthew, though, Jesus touches their eyes and makes no mention of their faith having healed them. So, just very briefly, those are the three accounts of this incident. I point out the similarities as much as the differences to provide evidence that these are in fact the same story and not two or three different stories. It's likely, in fact, that both Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources when they were writing their own Gospels. The scholarly consensus is that Mark was written around about 65 to 70 BCE, and that Matthew and Luke were written about 80 to 90 BCE, and that both of these used Mark's Gospel as one of their sources. So here we have three tellings of the same story. They agree in broad terms, although they vary in some of the details. But why is this? What does it mean? Well, I want to point out two main things. First, assuming that an event like this actually took place, it's likely that various accounts would circulate. After all, they say that there was a crowd present. Different witnesses would almost inevitably give slightly different accounts. We're aware of that in our own experience. Now, it's generally agreed that Luke also used a source known as Q in addition to the Gospel of Mark. Perhaps in this Q version, this incident was reported as having taken place as Jesus and the disciples approached Jericho rather than when they were leaving. Luke had two versions in front of him, Mark and Q, maybe others, and he opted on this occasion for Q's account. Now, I realise that's entirely speculation, but I offer it up as a possible reason for this difference. It's also possible, though, that this difference arises for the second reason, namely that the authors tweaked their narratives here and there to make a theological point or to emphasise something that was of particular importance and significance to them. I think this may be why, for example, Matthew and Luke refer to Jesus as Lord in the narrative rather than as Rabbi. In the couple of decades that had passed since Mark wrote his Gospel, perhaps Jesus' status had been elevated above that of a simple teacher, a simple rabbi, into that of a Lord, an almost celestial being. That would seem reasonable. Perhaps also Matthew spoke of two blind men rather than only one to emphasize Jesus' power. Or perhaps Matthew was in fact writing as a Jew who therefore recognized the importance of having two witnesses rather than just one. Then there's the fact that in Matthew's version, Jesus touches the two men's eyes. Perhaps this reflects the practice within Matthew's particular community of laying hands on people to heal them. Note that only Mark and Luke have Jesus saying that the man's faith has healed him. In Matthew, it's Jesus' touch that heals the two men. Why is that? Why does Matthew not follow Mark on this point, as Luke does? Perhaps again, this is to emphasize the power of Jesus. Perhaps it indicates some differences in the early Christian community about the role of faith in the healing process. In Matthew's version, healing depends not on the faith of the person, but on the power of Jesus. Now again, of course, this is speculation. I'm simply looking for possible explanations for these differences in detail. As with when I was discussing the two different creation narratives in Genesis, I'm not trying to create a gotcha moment here. My point is to show how and why these gospel accounts might differ, rather than pretending that they don't. And to do this, you really have to understand the human element of these stories. You have to understand that the writers of the Gospels used different oral and written sources. They didn't just sit around while the Holy Spirit dictated the Gospels to them, or while God moved their hand to write them himself. They did their work. They did their research. Matthew and Luke had Mark's Gospel in front of them. They also knew other stories or variants of these stories. They had to choose between them. Sometimes they modified them for their own purposes, including modifying Mark. In making these changes, they reflected the current beliefs within their particular community, or perhaps they revealed the author's particular interpretation of events, or maybe the author wanted to persuade his community concerning certain things. The importance of Jesus' power over the faith of the one who's healed, for example. Now, I don't care if you choose to call that process divine inspiration. I don't care if you think the Holy Spirit guided these authors as they were writing. However, if you gloss over these differences, or if you try once again to do mental gymnastics in order to reconcile these accounts, you're actually missing the point. You will miss any particular theological point, for example, that particularly Matthew and Luke were making when they changed what Mark had written or decided to use another source instead. In the days when I was actually an Anglican priest and used to preach sermons, if I was given this Matthew text, the focus in my sermon would actually be on the differences and trying to understand why Matthew made these changes and said these things differently. You're doing a disservice to these authors when you ignore their particular message. You're doing a disservice to the Bible by not making any attempt to understand the actual process by which these accounts came into being. The approach I would take to the Bible is the same as the approach I would take to any ancient text, trying to understand it within its historical and cultural context, trying to understand its development over time, trying to determine the author's intentions, identifying their sources and influences and so on, seeing how maybe later people had edited the text or added bits and pieces. The Bible is no different in this regard. I took the same approach to the Bible when I was a Christian and a theologian as I would take today. This is how you understand an historical document. Whether you believe the content you're reading, whether it has any personal, existential meaning or significance for you, is another question entirely. That should not affect your approach to the text. I would, however, argue that you can't really claim to believe this text if you don't first understand it. and you can't actually understand it if you adopt a literalist or fundamentalist approach to it. If you're not one of those who are simply going to waste their time in the comments explaining why I'm wrong, but you actually find this kind of content quite useful, please let me know if there's any particular issue that you'd like me to address. Now, these days, I don't have at my fingertips all the theological and biblical resources that I once had, but I will do my best to address this issue if I can.